In my wife's pocket, I found a ticket to a singles party. My heart raced, and a bitter sense of betrayal began to gnaw at every part of my body. The paper was there, wrinkled, as if it had been hastily put away, perhaps with the intention of never being found. I didn't need anything else, that was already proof of everything I feared, the reason I tried not to see, but which, somehow, was always in front of me. I looked at her with eyes that couldn't hide the shock, the distrust, the disgust. The question came out before I even thought, "What is this?" She froze. For a moment her eyes wavered, her breathing became heavy, ragged. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any words. It was clear there was something behind that ticket, something she was desperate to hide. I can explain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the excuse was being invented at that very moment. She began to stutter, moving her hands nervously, but each word seemed less convincing than the last. My heart was broken, and the pain I felt there, in that second, was more devastating than any I had ever experienced. Years of trust, of love, of sacrifices. Everything seemed to lose meaning at that moment. I should have seen the signs, the little lies, the cold excuses. Maybe I even saw it, but I chose to ignore it, because the truth hurts more than any comfortable lie. Now, there was no longer any way to ignore it. It was real. She kept talking, explaining that the ticket wasn't what it seemed, that there was a story behind it, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The feeling of betrayal had already taken over me so much that every word that came out of his mouth was like a poison, poisoning what was left of our marriage. "Did you?" I asked, my voice thick with bitterness. The shock that washed over his face at that moment confirmed everything. "I didn't need anything else." She hesitated, perhaps wondering if it was worth it to continue lying or if it was already too late. His lips trembled before he stammered a response I would never forget, "It's not what you think." "Isn't that what I think?" My voice rose, out of control. "I found the ticket in your pocket." What was I supposed to think? The pain was so much that I felt suffocated by my own words. I wanted to scream, break the silence that screamed louder than both of us. I wanted to understand how someone I loved so much could betray me like that. "Why did you do that? Why did you lie?" She took a step forward, trying to get closer, but the distance between us seemed infinite. "I didn't lie, I just..." "You just what?" I interrupted, full of fury and despair. I wanted answers, but deep down, I knew no explanation would be enough. Nothing would bring back the confidence I had lost at that moment. "It was a party, that's all." A party, his voice was broken, begging for understanding, but there was no more room for it. A singles party. Those words echoed in my mind like a sentence. What else would she have hidden? What other lies were behind our days together? I already knew that she kept secrets, small omissions that accumulated over the years. But at that moment, everything came to a head at once. The entry, the excuses, the distant behavior in recent weeks, the departures that didn't make sense. All of this lined up, like pieces of a puzzle that I didn't want to put together, but that was now complete in front of me. She tried to explain herself, tried to justify herself, but it was too late. The void in my chest was already formed, and there were no words that could fill the hole that discovery had created. "I'm no longer the idiot who believed your every word," I declared, feeling the bitter taste of truth in my mouth. "I loved you more than anything. I trusted you, and you threw it all away for one lie after another." She began to cry, tears streaming down her face, but I could no longer feel anything other than the dull, unrelenting pain of betrayal. "Let me explain, please," he begged, but I just shook my head. I didn't want to listen anymore. I was ready to move on, to leave behind everything we had built together, because what was left between us was no longer a marriage. It was an illusion, a well-told lie that fell apart with a simple piece of paper. But then, something in his expression changed. There was something more, something she hadn't told him yet. Her eyes widened, as if the truth she was about to confess was even more devastating than anything I could imagine. "I didn't tell you everything," she whispered, her voice now so low I could barely hear it. I turned slowly, facing her, waiting for her to finally reveal what was hidden behind that apologetic mask. My heart raced again, and I knew, in that instant, that there was something much darker behind that ticket, something that could destroy everything I thought I knew about her, about us. And then, in the agonizing silence, she finally said what I could never have imagined. Thomas watched the landscape outside, the light rain running down the windows of the cafe where he and Emily used to spend hours. That was their place. A small refuge where they could disconnect from the world, talk about trivialities or the dreams they had for the future. But that day, everything seemed different. The air was heavier, the silence between them uncomfortable. He ran his finger over his coffee cup, restless, but without knowing exactly why. Emily, sitting across from her, kept her eyes fixed on her phone, sliding her finger across the screen, lost in thought. The sparkle in her eyes, the one he loved so much, seemed increasingly distant. Something inside Thomas told him things were changing, but he refused to believe it. They had a solid history, a years-long relationship built on trust, companionship and a lot of love. Or so he thought. She was the type of person who lit up any room she walked into. Strong, determined, full of life. He was proud to have her by his side, and always believed that together they could face anything. Ever since they met, while still in college, they were inseparable. Thomas was the calm, thoughtful balance to Emily's vibrant energy. He always liked how she challenged him, how she wasn't afraid to question the world around her. This fascinated him and, at the same time, terrified him. The thought of losing her was a pain he didn't want to imagine. In recent months, however, something had changed. Emily had become more reserved, less present. The once lively conversations now seemed forced, as if she were somewhere else, far away. Thomas tried to convince himself it was just the stress of work, the fast pace of adult life. After all, everyone went through moments like this, didn't they? Couples, over time, go through more difficult phases, but he believed it would pass. It always passed. What he couldn't ignore, however, were the evasive smiles, the lame excuses about work meetings, the messages she typed quickly on her cell phone and then hid. Thomas always considered himself a rational person, someone who didn't let paranoia take over. He trusted Emily. Or, at least, he always did. "Everything is fine?" he asked, trying to hide the uneasiness in his voice. Emily looked up, as if suddenly brought back to reality. "What?" "Oh, yes, of course. I'm just tired." A forced smile crossed her face, and she looked back at the phone. The coldness of that gesture hurt him more than he expected. Thomas knew Emily like no one else. I knew that behind that confident facade was a vulnerability that she rarely let on. She was always so good at controlling her emotions, at hiding any weaknesses. This fascinated him, but it also worried him. Lately, she was more distant, shrouded in a kind of emotional fog that he couldn't approach. He felt like he was losing the person he loved most, and this left him with an anguish that only grew as the days went by. They had built a life together in a city they both loved. The house was cozy, full of memories of travels and happy moments. The photos on the shelf, the books they shared and discussed, the promises they made on the nights they talked until dawn. All of this formed a web that kept Thomas trapped in the idea that what they had was strong enough to withstand any storm. But now, sitting there, watching Emily's face in the dim light of the cafe, he was beginning to question whether that web was still enough to hold them. There was something different about her, something that he couldn't identify clearly, but that bothered him deeply. Maybe it was the way she avoided looking into his eyes, or how her responses became short, almost automatic. Whatever it was there, hovering between them, silent but unrelenting. "Do you remember when we used to come here?" Thomas tried to pull up a memory, a moment that could bring them back to that sense of connection that once seemed unshakable. We spent hours talking about the future. About our plans. How everything seemed so clear back then, didn't it? Emily looked up, but not with the same intensity as before. There was something dull about her, a glow he could barely recognize. Yes, of course, it seemed simpler back then, she replied, without much conviction. Silence fell between them again, heavy, uncomfortable. Thomas wanted to ask what was really going on, but he feared the answer. Part of him preferred to believe that it was just his own fears taking shape, that this was all just a bad phase. He loved her deeply, and he couldn't bear the idea that something could be corrupting what they had. But the doubt was there, eating away at his confidence, taking root more and more. Emily's cell phone vibrated on the table, breaking her out of her daze. She quickly picked it up, typed something, and put it back in her bag. Thomas couldn't help but notice the rush, the nervousness in her movements. That made something inside him twist. Who was it? The question came out more direct than he expected. She hesitated. Just a message from work, nothing important. He knew that wasn't true. He knew every detail of her, and it was clear that something was being hidden. But at the same time, he didn't want to pressure her. At least not yet. He needed to understand what was happening, without exploding immediately, without turning that coffee table into an arena of accusations. Emily stood up suddenly, grabbing her bag and putting on her coat. I need to go, Thomas. We have an early meeting tomorrow, and I'm exhausted. He looked at her, silently pained to see her so far away. There was no longer any trace of the woman he used to talk to late at night. The woman in front of him looked like a stranger. Are you sure everything is okay? He insisted, unable to let the matter drop there. She paused for a long time before responding. Yes, it's okay, he said, without much conviction. We'll talk tomorrow, okay? And with that, she left the cafe, leaving Thomas behind, immersed in a mixture of frustration and fear. He knew there was something deeply wrong. Something she was hiding. And in that moment, he made the decision to discover what was behind that growing distance, even if it meant facing a truth he wasn't ready to hear. The rain outside was thickening, beating hard against the windows. Thomas stood there, looking at the empty table in front of him, as if the silence of that cafe was the only thing left of their relationship. Something had changed, he knew it. And, somehow, I sensed that the life I knew would never be the same again. Thomas spent the next few days in a state of constant alert. Emily's words in the cafe continued to echo in his mind, but what bothered him most were her gestures. The avoided looks, the touches that never came again. The feeling of disconnection between them grew like a shadow, and he knew he needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. That week, Emily continued leaving home earlier than usual and returning late, always with excuses about work. But there was something about her behavior that made Thomas doubt. She was increasingly distant, and the silences between them became too long to be normal. Before, one look was enough for her to open up to him, but now, her every question was answered vaguely, almost automatically. One night, as she slept next to him, Thomas lay awake, watching her. It was hard to believe that the woman who was lying there peacefully could be hiding something. But the signs were there. The little slips, the schedules that didn't make sense. He remembered the nights they laughed together, how vibrant she was, full of life. And now she was blank, as if something or someone was draining her energy. The feeling of doubt gnawed at him. Insecurity made him question everything, her words, her gestures, even the way she mechanically kissed him before leaving for work. But as much as he tried to shake off the idea that something was terribly wrong, a part of him knew he needed answers. And then he made a decision. The next day, after Emily left, Thomas stayed at home, waiting for the opportunity to arise. He knew he couldn't confront her without proof, and as much as guilt tormented him at even thinking about violating her privacy, he needed to find out the truth. When the time came, he went to the closet where she usually kept her bag. He hesitated for a moment, but then opened the main zipper, rummaging through it carefully. The feeling of invasion made him sick, but he knew that if he didn't do it, he would go crazy with doubts. At the bottom of one of the bag's pockets, her fingers touched a folded piece of paper. As he pulled it out, his heart skipped a beat. It was a ticket to a party. A singles party. Thomas felt the world crashing down around him. He stared at the ticket for several minutes, the paper shaking in his hands. Singles. What would she be doing at a party like that? What did that mean? The feeling of betrayal and helplessness was overwhelming. A part of him wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but reality was beginning to form before his eyes, cruel and inevitable. He closed the bag back, taking a deep breath, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that were gathering inside him. His mind raced, looking for answers he might not want to find. Why would she have a ticket to a singles party? Thomas could no longer think clearly. His heart was pounding, and he knew he could no longer escape the truth. The betrayal, somehow, was there, staring him in the face. That night he was silent during dinner. Emily seemed restless, stealing glances in his direction but saying nothing. Thomas expected her to give herself up, to say something that could explain that ticket. But her words were just empty, as if she were only physically present. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. When Emily got up from the table, saying she had to work late, Thomas followed her with his gaze. She was dressed casually, as if she was really just for a meeting. But something in his posture betrayed something else. He needed answers. At that moment, he decided he would follow her. He waited about an hour before leaving the house. He discreetly followed to where Emily had parked the car, keeping enough distance to not be noticed. His mind was racing, imagining what he would find at the end of that path. What was he about to discover? Emily drove to a busy neighborhood, where she parked next to a club. Thomas parked the car further away so he could watch without being seen. She got out, looked around quickly, as if making sure there was no one she knew, and then walked towards the entrance. Thomas watched from afar, feeling a mix of nausea and anger. His body was shaking, and his heart was beating wildly. There was no going back now. He got out of the car and went to the club entrance, where the sign on the sign confirmed his worst suspicions: singles party, exclusive entry. The ticket he had found in Emily's pocket was connected to all of this. The pieces finally fell into place. With a heavy heart and an upset stomach, Thomas returned to the car. He didn't have the strength to go in and face what was probably happening inside. Everything he had imagined, everything they had built together, was falling apart. There was no longer any way to deny reality. Emily was cheating on him. He stayed there, still for long minutes, trying to process what he had just discovered. The distant nights, the excuses, the evasive behavior, it all made sense now. She was no longer the same person he had married. And he, heartbroken, wondered how someone he loved so much could do something so devastating. Thomas returned home that night burdened with a grief he had never imagined possible. His heart was shattered, and the doubts that once consumed him now turned into a bitter, cruel certainty. He had seen Emily walk into that party, he had witnessed her betrayal with his own eyes, and now, the void she left behind was impossible to ignore. There was no turning back. The trust that once united them had been irreparably broken. For days, he remained silent. Living at home has become a heavy burden. He couldn't look at Emily the same way. Her smiles, her words, everything seemed to be a well-disguised lie, a mask she wore to hide the truth. Thomas felt suffocated, a prisoner of a relationship that now seemed false in every detail. Try as he might, he couldn't confront her. The fear of hearing the confession, of facing betrayal, paralyzed him. He was still trying, somehow, to keep up appearances, hoping that he was mistaken, that there was some rational explanation for what he saw. But the sleepless nights and the tightness in my chest left no doubt. Emily cheated on him, and he didn't know how to face it. It was on a cold night, while they were both at home, that Thomas decided he could no longer go on like this. He needed to hear it from her, needed her to confirm what his heart already knew. The silence between them, which before was just uncomfortable, had now become unbearable. Emily was in the living room, leafing through a magazine without much interest, while the television was broadcasting some program. Thomas watched her from afar, trying to find in the woman in front of him some trace of the person he had married. But all I saw was a stranger. We need to talk. His words cut through the air, cold, direct. Emily looked up, surprised, but said nothing. He walked over and sat down next to her, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. Thomas, what happened? You've been so strange these days. He stared at her for a moment, fighting the anger building in his chest. How could she pretend so well? How could she act like everything was normal? Hatred and sadness mixed together, and he felt like he was about to explode. I know about the party, Emily. I know you were there, he said, his voice shaking, trying to keep himself under control. Her face changed instantly. The smile she was trying to maintain disappeared, and her eyes widened for a moment before she managed to regain her composure. The silence between them was palpable, every second charged with tension. Party? What party? Emily tried to hide it, her voice sounding forced, but Thomas wouldn't be fooled. I found the ticket in your pocket. I saw you going into that club, he said, his voice now steady despite the pain evident in every word. Don't try to lie to me. I know what you did. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on something far away, as if she were trying to find a way out, an excuse that could alleviate the situation. But there were no more lies that could protect her now. Thomas knew everything, and she had nowhere to run. Why? Thomas's question was filled with suffering. Why did you do that? What did I do wrong? Emily shook her head, her breathing now ragged as tears began to stream down her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed stuck, as if she were fighting something much bigger than a confession of betrayal. She tried to begin, but her voice trailed off. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Thomas. I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't you want to hurt me? Thomas laughed bitterly. How can you say that? You went to a singles party, Emily. You cheated on me and you still have the nerve to say you didn't want to hurt me? She sobbed, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe away her tears. I never wanted this to happen. I just don't know what to do anymore. Don't know what to do. He repeated in disbelief. You don't know what to do. I've loved you for all these years, Emily. I gave my all to this marriage, and you betray me like this. Why? She looked at him, her eyes swollen from crying. It's not as simple as it seems. It's not about you, Thomas. It was never about you. So what is it about? He screamed, unable to hold back the rage that consumed him. If it's not about me, then tell me, for God's sake, what is it? Why did you do this? Emily shook her head, as if words were insufficient to express what she felt. I can't take it anymore. I feel like I'm suffocating. And that party, it was a mistake, I know. I shouldn't have gone. But, there's something more. Something you don't know. Thomas frowned, confused. Anything else? What are you hiding from me, Emily? She took a deep breath, trying to control the tears that continued to fall. I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want things to come to this. But I kept in touch with someone from my past. Someone I thought I was over, but he came back to me life in a way I didn't expect. Thomas felt a shiver run up his spine. Who is he? He asked, his voice hoarse. Emily hesitated for a long moment, before finally releasing the truth she had been carrying for so long. It's an ex-boyfriend. We started talking again a few months ago. And he was the one who invited me to the party. The revelation hit Thomas like a punch in the gut. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. An ex-boyfriend? Someone she had kept secret all this time. The betrayal ran deeper than he could imagine. You've been talking to him this whole time. And you haven't told me anything. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he tried to process the information. I thought I could control it, Emily replied, her voice shaking. I thought it was just a friendship. But things got out of hand. Did they get out of control? Thomas stood up, unable to sit still as anger consumed him. You went after him, Emily. You went to a singles party he threw. How could this have gotten out of hand? You knew what you were doing. She flinched at his fury, but didn't try to justify herself any further. She knew there were no excuses. She knew she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. But there was something more, something she had not yet revealed, and Thomas felt that the full confession was yet to come. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas breathed heavily, pain and disappointment written all over his face. He didn't know how to move forward from there, he didn't know how he could forgive her after all that. But then Emily spoke, her voice weak, barely audible. There's one more thing you need to know. Something I didn't tell you, about him. Thomas stopped, looking at her suspiciously. What else could there be, Emily? What else are you hiding from me? She stared at him, tears still streaming down her face. He isn't just an ex-boyfriend, Thomas. He's someone I've never gotten over. And I never told you this because I thought that by loving you, I could forget how I felt about him. But he came back, and everything was confused. Thomas's world, which was already in shambles, completely collapsed with those words. He didn't know what to say, how to react. Everything he thought he knew about Emily's love for him, about their marriage, now seemed like a cruel lie. There was still more to be said, and Thomas knew it. What else was Emily hiding? What else could she reveal that would make everything even worse? The truth was about to be revealed, and Thomas wasn't sure he was ready to hear what she had to say. Thomas remained motionless, staring at Emily as if he were seeing a completely unknown person. Her words still echoed in his mind, over and over again, I never got over it. This was a much deeper blow than any physical betrayal. It wasn't just a momentary mistake, but a shadow that had always existed in their relationship, something he could never have imagined. A feeling she had kept secret all these years. He felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet, as if every memory he had built alongside her was crumbling. The trips, the promises, the life plans together. Now, everything seemed empty, insignificant. As if none of that had really mattered to her. The man he thought was the love of Emily's life was actually always competing with a ghost. I need more explanation, Thomas finally said, his voice somber, barely audible. He didn't know how to continue, but he knew he needed to hear the rest, no matter how painful it was. Emily lowered her head, as if carrying the weight of her own words was unbearable. He was my first love, Thomas. And I could never really forget him. We broke up because I was too young, and our lives went our separate ways. But when I met you, I thought that was enough, I thought that the love we built together could erase what I felt for him. For a while, I really believed that. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to absorb that confession. The woman he loved, who he believed he loved deeply, was speaking of a love that had never been his. He was just a placeholder, a desperate attempt to forget someone who still occupied her heart. When he came back. I wasn't prepared, Emily continued, still unable to look Thomas in the eye. It was a surprise. He found me on social media and at first we were just talking like old friends. I swear to you, at first it seemed harmless. Thomas remembered all the times she said she was busy, the nights she spent working, the messages on her phone that she quickly deleted. He had always suspected, but never wanted to believe. Now everything made sense, every small gesture, every suspicious silence. It was him. It was always about him. So, what happened? Thomas asked, his voice broken with pain, but he needed to hear it through. Did you meet? Emily nodded slowly, tears falling uncontrollably. Yes, we met. I tried to resist at first, but after a few conversations, it was like all those old feelings came back with a vengeance. I was confused, Thomas. I didn't know who I was or what I wanted anymore. Her words were like daggers. He imagined the scene, her in the arms of another man, someone with whom she shared a past he could never compete with. The physical betrayal was devastating, but the emotional betrayal, the way she allowed herself to revive old feelings, hit him in a way he could never have imagined. And you, slept with him? The question came out before he could control himself, and he immediately hated the vulnerability in her voice. Emily hesitated, the words seeming to catch in her throat, but she knew there were no more lies to be told. No, she whispered. I didn't go that far. But I thought about it, Thomas. I seriously thought about it. And that's horrible enough. The air seemed to become heavy around them. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if they were both trying to understand the abyss that now separated them. For Thomas, the revelation that Emily had not physically consummated the betrayal brought only fleeting relief. The emotional damage was already done, their marriage was tainted by something he didn't know if he would be able to forgive. So why did you go to that party? He asked, trying to find a reason, anything that could make sense of what was happening. If you didn't physically cheat, why did you do it? What were you looking for? Emily took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a second, as if preparing herself for the hardest confession of all. I went to the party because he asked me to. He told me he wanted to see me again, that it would be a chance for us to talk about everything, about what happened between us. And I went, Thomas. I went because, at that moment, I wanted to relive what I felt for him. I wanted to know if there was still something there. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. The woman he had shared his life with, who he had sworn to love and protect, was confessing that she had chosen someone else, who had gone to pick up what was left of an old relationship while he blindly believed everything was fine. Do you realize what you're saying? He asked, voice wavering. You were willing to throw away everything we built, our entire history, to see if you still had feelings for him. Is this who I am to you? Emily began to cry more intensely, but there were no more words she could use to soften the truth. I know I was wrong, Thomas. I know. And every time I think about it, I feel horrible. I wish I knew what would have happened if I had stayed with him, if our lives had gone another way. Then why are you here now? Why did you come back to me? Thomas asked, heartbroken. If you wanted to relive this past so much, why are you still here? She looked at him, her eyes swollen with tears, her face marked with guilt. Because, in the end, he wasn't what I imagined. We talked, and it was strange, uncomfortable. He wasn't the same man I loved in the past. And it was in that moment that I realized. I realized that the love we built together, Thomas, is real. He was part of my past, but you are my present. But her words, although sincere, no longer reached Thomas. He was broken. The idea that she had contemplated another man, that she had allowed herself to relive old feelings while he struggled to keep their marriage afloat, was unbearable. So, what do we do now? Thomas asked, defeated, not knowing how to continue from that point. Emily didn't respond right away. She knew the wound she had caused was too deep to be healed with words. They were at a point of no return, and they both knew it. I don't know, she finally said, her voice breaking. But I love you, Thomas. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. And I hope we can find a way to get past this. But in Thomas's heart, the words, "I love you," rang hollow. The weight of emotional betrayal and lies was too great for him to bear alone. The truths Emily had revealed could not simply be forgotten. And now, he needed to decide if he would be able to move on or if the ghost of that ex-boyfriend would haunt them forever. Emily reached out, lightly touching Thomas's arm, as if trying to establish a connection that was already broken. He looked at her hand, but he didn't feel the same warmth as before. She was there, by his side, but the distance between them was immeasurable. What would he do with all these revelations? How can you move forward knowing that, at some point, he was just a second option? The silence in the room was overwhelming. Thomas, sitting on the edge of the bed, couldn't organize his thoughts. Everything seemed blurry, as if he were sunk in a thick fog that didn't let him see clearly. Emily was there, close, but as far away as she had ever been. Her touch, which had once comforted him, now felt empty, almost like a cruel reminder of the gulf that separated them. He wanted to escape that place, those confusing emotions and the unbearable pain that gnawed at his chest. But there was no escape. The truth was there, naked, revealed. And now, he needed to deal with her. Thomas's eyes wandered around the room, as if looking for some refuge to hide from the whirlwind of emotions. There was a suffocating weight on him, the pressure of making a decision that could change everything. He knew he couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. The marriage they had built was in pieces, scattered across the floor like shards of glass that he didn't know if he would be able to put back together again. Emily, sitting on the other side of the bed, couldn't stop looking at him. There was a mix of guilt and despair in her eyes, as if she was waiting for a redemption that might never come. She had confessed everything. He revealed that his past was not just a distant memory, but something that still shaped his actions and feelings. And now, the fate of their relationship was in Thomas's hands. "What do I do with this?" he muttered, almost to himself, his voice echoing softly in the room. It wasn't a question directed at Emily, but at himself. The emotional betrayal he had discovered weighed on his shoulders in ways he could never have imagined. Would it be possible to continue after that? Was it possible to love someone who kept you in the background, as a substitute for a love that had never been surpassed? He knew that the dilemma before him was much deeper than a simple choice between staying or going. It was a struggle between the love he still felt for Emily and the pain this revelation had caused. There was a desire to forgive, to find a way to overcome, but there was also the voice inside that told him that something so fundamental had been broken, and that perhaps it would be impossible to restore what they had. "I never wanted it to be like this, Thomas," Emily said, breaking the heavy silence that hung between them. His voice was choked, full of emotion. "I love you, I really do. I just got lost for a while." Thomas took a deep breath, trying to process those words. They rang true, but the impact of the betrayal was still so fresh that he didn't know how to respond. How to forgive someone who had, even if for brief moments, wanted someone else. Getting lost doesn't justify it, Emily, he said, his voice finally finding a firm tone. "I spent all these years by your side, giving you my all. And in the end, I was just a replacement." Emily shook her head, desperate for him to understand what she was trying to explain. "No, that's not it. It wasn't you that was the problem, Thomas. It was me. I let the past come back when it shouldn't have. I let what I felt for him cloud what we had. But what I have with you, it's real. And I only realized that after I almost lost you." Thomas was silent again. He knew Emily was being sincere, but there was a bitter truth he couldn't ignore. Even though the love they had was real, that didn't erase the fact that, at some point, she had doubted. And that doubt was like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Did you really love me?" he asked suddenly, the pain evident in his voice. "Or was I just a patch for what you thought was missing in your life?" Emily froze at the question. She knew that was the central question of everything. The doubt he carried, the fear that it was just a second option. Thomas, you were more than that. I never wanted it to be like this. I loved you, I love you. But I admit, a part of me could never completely detach from what I felt before. And that's not fair like you. Emily's words cut Thomas like knives. He knew she was being honest, but the truth was too painful to digest. Their marriage has always been haunted by that ghost, that unresolved love that Emily kept. And as much as she said she loved him, he no longer knew if that was enough to keep them together. He got up from the bed, walking to the window and watching the dark sky outside. The night seemed to reflect the darkness he felt within himself. I just wish you'd told me that sooner, he murmured. Before everything falls apart. Emily slowly got up and went to him, but she didn't dare touch him. There was a distance between them now that seemed impossible to cross. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid that you wouldn't understand, afraid of losing you. And that's why I hid behind this lie. Thomas turned to her, his eyes tired and full of pain. What now? What do you expect from me, Emily? Do you want me to pretend like none of this happened? That I just forgive you and forget about it? She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to expect, Thomas. I just know that I love you and that I'm willing to fight for us. But I understand if you feel like you can't go on. I understand if I've lost you forever. Her words hung in the air, and Thomas knew, in that moment, that the choice was in his hands. He could try to forgive her, try to rebuild what had been destroyed, or he could accept that their marriage had been irrevocably compromised. Both options seemed equally painful. The trust had been broken, and he didn't know if he would be able to move forward with such a broken heart. And as the night deepened outside, he wondered if he would ever be able to forgive what Emily had done. The days that followed were filled with silence that seemed endless. Thomas and Emily continued to live under the same roof, but it was as if each was in a parallel universe, unable to reach the other. The conversations were brief and superficial, and Thomas's gaze never met Emily's in the same way again. Time passed slowly, as if the very air inside the house was saturated with pain and resentment. Thomas spent sleepless nights, reflecting on the weight of everything that had happened. Every word spoken, every confession Emily made, echoed in her mind like an incessant hammering. He wanted to forgive her. He wanted to believe that they could overcome it, rebuild what had been broken, but something inside him resisted. The shattered trust was like a slowly spreading poison, eroding any chance of healing. Emily, on the other hand, was desperately trying to remedy the situation. She was willing to do anything to win Thomas back, to prove that she still loved him and that the mistake she had made didn't define everything they lived through. But at the same time, she knew that the damage caused might be irreparable. Every attempt to get closer to him was frustrated by his coldness, by his silence that said more than any words. One night, when the tension seemed unbearable, Thomas finally spoke. He was in the kitchen, standing in front of the sink, staring into space. Emily walked in and stood beside him, hesitantly. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, fearing what would come next, but she knew she could no longer delay the inevitable. "Yes," she replied softly, feeling the weight of the impending conversation. "I tried," Thomas began, not looking away from the window in front of him. "I tried to forgive you, I tried to understand what happened. But the truth is, I can't. I can't keep living this lie." Emily felt her heart sink, but she didn't say anything. She knew it was Thomas's turn to vent. "I thought we could get through this, that in time, the pain would lessen and I could forget what you did. But every time I look at you, I see what you hid from me, I see the love you gave to another person, and it destroys me inside. I'm not the man you truly loved, Emily. I was a second choice." Thomas's words hit Emily like knives. She already knew, deep down, that this was the feeling he carried, but hearing it out loud was devastating. Tears began to silently run down her face, but she knew that, this time, there was no way to reverse what was about to happen. You ask me to believe that we can still have a future together, but how, he continued, finally turning to face her. How can I look at us and not see the betrayal, the lie, the past you hid from me? I truly loved you, Emily. I would give anything for you. But now, I don't know who we are anymore. She took a deep breath, wiping her tears with the back of her hands. I understand if you can't forgive me, Thomas. I understand if you want this to end here. But I never lied when I said I loved you. And I still love you. It's just, maybe not that be more sufficient. Thomas looked at her, his eyes full of pain but also acceptance. I know you loved me. But that love is no longer enough to erase what happened. We lost each other, Emily. And I don't think there's any going back. The silence that fell between them felt like the final point they both feared. It was not a decision made in anger, nor in a fit of rage. It was the cold, painful realization that their marriage, the love that had once been so strong, had been corroded by distrust and emotional betrayal. Emily nodded slowly, not trying to argue. She knew deep down that Thomas was right. What they had built was destroyed, and continuing to try to patch up something that was no longer salvageable would only prolong the pain for both of them. I'm leaving, Thomas said, after a long moment of silence. Tomorrow, I'm leaving home. I can't stay here. Emily didn't argue. She knew this was the end. The next morning, Thomas packed his things in silence. There were no more tears, no more accusations. It was a bittersweet farewell, filled with resignation and pain. Emily stood in the doorway as he left, looking distant, trying to hold back crying. She knew that, at that moment, she had lost the man who, despite everything, truly loved her. Thomas, as he walked through the door for the last time, felt a mixture of relief and despair. Relief at no longer having to carry the weight of that betrayal, but also despair at knowing that the love he valued so much had come to an end. He has moved on, leaving behind the memories and promises that once meant the world to him. Emily, in turn, remained in the empty house, reflecting on the mistakes she had made and the choices that led her to that moment. She knew that no matter what, the scars of betrayal and regret would remain forever, not just on Thomas, but on her as well. Their marriage, which seemed unshakable, was destroyed by a truth that neither of them knew how to face. Now, both would need to find a way to move forward, each dealing with what was left of the love they once shared. What did you think of the story? Was it exciting, surprising? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories and, remember, betrayal is a choice that can destroy lives. This channel does not in any way support cheating in any relationship.